Hello, in this video, I'm going to record second part of the fiscal policy chapter. So you remember there in December, just before Christmas, we covered the main taxes within the Irish economy. So that was the first part of the fiscal policy chapter, okay? And the second part is covered in this PowerPoint. It's a very large chapter, so you have to break it up into separate chunks. Um, but you'll remember when we talked about taxation, we looked at the different taxes that exist in the Irish economy, like VAT, PRSI, PAYE. There's a big list of them, and we talked about all of them and their different characteristics and so on and so forth. And we looked at the canons of taxation, principles of taxation, and all the different definitions associated with taxation, things like tax avoidance, direct tax, specific tax, tax evasion, all those sorts of definitions. And the list goes on. There's lots of different bits and pieces on that sheet that you need to know for your exams. But I've laid it out there in that part. So I want to just isolate the two separate parts of the chapter. Tax is just one tool that the government uses. So now we're going to look more at the budgetary framework. This PowerPoint in this video is going to focus on things like budgets, like whether it's budget deficit or budget surplus, the government debt, national debt, how that's dealt with, and also things like who controls national debt and what influence does the Eurozone have over our national debt, or what influence does the EU have over our national debt, or over our general economic affairs, over our fiscal policy. I'm going to look at all those separate things in this video, and it's going to be broken up into separate parts. I'm going to cut it into 3 chunks so that you can watch it much easier, and just for myself as well, so that I'm not recording one full video. But there's 2 links with this chapter with other sections of the course in particular, very close links. Obviously, everything is really linked together in economics, but I just want to bring to your attention chapter 11 that we studied earlier on in the year, which refers to national income. In that chapter, we looked at things like how to measure the economy. For example, the circular flow of income, the multiplier effects, GMP, GDP, GNI, and so on. And we also looked at things that influence savings, consumption, and investment. So really what we're trying to do there is we're trying to quantify the economy. We're trying to put the economy in numbers. So for example, we're trying to say that GNP last year grew by 6%. Or that the multiplier effect is 1.5 times. So for every investment, we get out and a profit that is 1.5 times our initial investment. And with things like savings, consumption, and investment, looking what influences them, they're all numbers as well. So when we get those figures, we need to know how to use those to adjust our policies, or to how to make them better, for example. So if GDP is only 1% this year, how can we make it 9% next year? 9% is a very large figure, but just using it as an example. So we use something like fiscal policy, okay? I'm going to look in more detail at that now in a minute. But also I want to draw a distinction between fiscal policy and monetary policy, okay? Because in chapter 14, we discussed inflation, and part of that chapter referred to central banks, and central banks impose what's called monetary policy. And there's 2 types of policy that we refer to mainly in economics. There's fiscal policy, which is controlled in Ireland by the Irish government, likes of Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, Sinn Féin, and so on. Whoever passes the legislation, they control our fiscal policy. Whereas our monetary policy is controlled in Europe, or in Brussels, by the European Central Bank, the Irish branch of which is the Central Bank of Ireland. So they're 2 completely independent institutions. Obviously, the fiscal policy governors, i.e. the Irish government, is democratically elected, whereas the European Central Bank and the people that control that agency are not democratically elected. So there's a complete separation of powers between the 2 of those. So without any more ado, I'm just going to start explaining the fiscal policy and the budgetary framework PowerPoint. So on the first slide here, we're looking at the implications of a budget deficit. Okay, so just to briefly define what a budget deficit is, it's when our expenditures exceed or are larger than the amount of money we take in taxes. Okay, and there can be some positive and negative outcomes to having a budget deficit. The first I've brought up there is an increase in the national debt, which leads to debt servicing. And debt servicing is just the action of paying off your debt. So when you pay off your debt, that is called debt servicing. You go to the ECB and you, trade some bonds for cash, you paid off your debt. So that isn't the money to pay for that debt servicing isn't plucked out of thin air. has to be paid for with Irish taxes, and has to be funded by the taxpayer, by you and me, when we go out and we pay VAT, when we pay PRSI, PAYE, and so on. It goes into the Irish coffers, in the Exchequer, the Irish government. They then pay it out to the European Central Bank. So that tax bill, obviously, if we have a lot of budget deficits, that debt bill is going to be very high. So we want to try and keep a lid on those deficits, according to this first point. There can also be an inflationary impact which can occur as well. So, for example, during the Celtic Tiger, Ireland was still engaging in deficit spending to a certain extent, so that it was putting more money into the economy than it was taking out in taxes. So when you're pumping lots of money into the economy and not taking it back, you're going to decrease the value of the currency or the money that you're putting in, and that can be very harmful. It can push up prices if the production of goods and services cannot keep up with all this extra money that you're putting into the economy. So it can create a lot of problems. And I've said there, it can cause the economy to overheat. And you can see some of these illustrations here help to quite saliently bring up that point. You can see here it's overflowing a bit. It's quite emblematic, or quite a good description. And another one here as well, these men trying to keep the lid on the pot. It's quite a good illustration of when we become excessive with government spending, that can create problems. It can create overheating. It can also lead to a fall in the credit rating of the Irish government. So back during the bailout times, when we were in a recession, in the financial crisis in around 2008 or so, the Irish government had to go and get a set of loans because it had bailed out the banks. The banks had gone bust, they had a lot of debt, and this had to be paid for by the Irish government, the Irish state. And as a result, then the Irish state had a lot of debt. The Irish state had to fund that debt some way. So they had to go to the international markets, but the debt was too expensive there. So their credit rating, I should say, fell. And that means they faced higher interest rates. So there's a lot of problems associated with if you deficit spend too much. If you have too many budget deficits and those deficits are too large, you will lose your reputation as your ability to pay your creditors. Okay, if you cannot pay your creditors, you're not seen as being credit worthy, and it can be hard for you to get a loan. So the Irish state is still trying to repair that image of itself from the bailout times of 2008 onwards, 2010. And also you can cite the violation of a Maastricht Treaty or EU budget rules as a possible rationale for not engaging in too much deficit spending. The EU has said you should not spend any more than 3% of your GDP in deficit spending on an annual basis, and that your national debt, your total overall debt, all your cumulative budget deficits should not exceed 60% of your GDP. That's another rule they have. But just specifically referring to deficits here, we're given the figure of 3%. Okay, this has actually been relaxed, I should note, during the coronavirus, during the stimulus measures that the government has put in place, all this extra spending. The Irish government has gone past this benchmark and has been allowed, or the restrictions have been relaxed by the EU temporarily, or whether it will continue permanently, that's to be seen. But at the moment, that is the scenario with Ireland. And then just to move on to some of the implications of a budget surplus, you're flipping a lot of these points on their head, but it gives us an opportunity to reduce our national debt and to pay off our creditors and to actually improve our credit worthiness, compared to the opposite there, which was the case with paying off. Sorry, the opposite was the case there when we're becoming less creditworthy. So if you're not able to make your debt repayments, you're becoming less creditworthy. Whereas when you have a surplus here and you try to pay off your debt, that's seen as a very good thing, and you enhance your reputation on the international scale as a result. So it also helps to dampen demand in the economy if it's overheating. So essentially what the government does when they create a budget surplus is they take in more money in taxes than they spend out. So that means that there's money being taken out of the economy. They're literally coming in there and they're taking money from people's back pockets, okay? And they're not putting it back in there again. So that what that does is it helps to dampen down demand. If the economy is becoming too shall we say, rapid with its growth, economy is growing too rapidly and the prices are going too high, they can help to put a lid on things. As we showed in those slides there, it can just help to keep a cap on the pot. It also allows the Irish state to establish a rainy day fund, which we actually did. and it can help to boost cash reserves of the NTMA. And this illustration here helps to portray that, because during the coronavirus restrictions, when they were implemented at first, there wasn't that much money within the reserves, but this shot up after the measures were announced, because they had to put more money into the NTMA so that they could pay it out to people on, for example, the PUP, the temporary wage subsidy scheme, and so on. So the government had to increase its expenditure, and it could do so because it had this money in the rainy day. So the idea is that when you're going good, when the economy is doing well, you take a little bit extra in taxes, so that when it's bad, you're able to spend that money back out again to try and boost the economy. That's the kind of the intuition behind why you would create a budget surplus when times are good, so that you can maybe afford to carry out some deficit spending when times are not so good. And also, there's a negative point there in that it can curtail economic growth, because the government is taking out more money than it puts back in. So that can be problematic as well, because if you're not experiencing inflation and you have stable prices, you can actually lead to deflation, because you're taking money away from people, and the production of goods and services can outpace the printing of money, which, as we looked at in chapter 14 on inflation, that can lead to deflation, which means the prices fall and spiral out of control, and that can actually have a very harmful impact on the economy, because as we discussed, the deflationary spiral can be very problematic. So that's the first part of this this PowerPoint. So I'm going to stop the video here, and I'm going to continue with the next few slides in the next video.